I want to draw your attention to a few things. We're doing the study on Matthew, and there are a couple really good commentaries. Well, there are several really good commentaries. One of my favorite commentaries on Matthew is this one right here. I told you about last week, called Reading Matthew by David Garland. And the series is called, well, I think it's called the Reading Series. There's Reading Galatians, Philippians, Reading Mark, Reading Romans. It is a narrative literary look at it. It does some historical context, but it's, I think, very accessible, very readable. It's not full of technical jargon. It's a very good medium level commentary, if I can say that, medium level.
By who now?
This is David Garland. At the time he was professor, I think now he's vice president, blah, I don't know. Last I heard, he was the dean of the divinity school at Truett Seminary at Baylor. Nice guy, salt pepper hair with a beard, glasses, professorial looking. And this is one of my favorites on Matthew. I think he's a clear writer. I think he has really good insight, and he's good. So anyway, David Garland's book, Reading Matthew, is good. And every once in a while I might throw in a couple others here and there. There's another one coming that it's on its way by Craig Keener. I think it's about 800 pages, though, so I'm not going to give you that one. But 500, 600 pages. Keener doesn't write short books. He writes a long book. This is a different guy. So I like that. See, the whole book is there. Anyway, there you go. Reading Matthew is a good one. And this is Study on Matthew. Let's get going. So instead of doing handouts, which I'm not sure if we need or not, every once in a while I might do that. I want to jump in there and we'll get started. So let's turn to Matthew chapter 1, verse 1 if you have it. If you're going to take notes, go for it. But before, while you're looking for Matthew 1:1, which won't take you long to find, I want to do very quickly a little crash course intro into gospel studies. Gospel studies. You might not have thought about this before, but hopefully those who have done the Bible for all it's worth and have been in any of my groups before, you've asked the question, what's the genre? What kind of literature is this? And to ask that question of all the letters or documents or books of the Bible is always a good question. Genre, what is the literary type? And scholars for a long time classified the Gospels as a genre, different kinds of genres for a long time. What they mostly agreed upon was that they're not biographies because they don't sound like modern biographies. There's a German scholar named Rudolf Bultmann who championed that. And then back in the 70s, in fact, probably around 77, 78, I think it was, my former professor, Charles Talbert, wrote a response to Bultmann. I'm just giving a little nerd talk here. And he called the book, it's a real short book. And he's going, what is a gospel? And he takes Bultmann to task. And that changed the whole tide. You think Bultmann's wrong here, because when you compare the Gospels to the ancient form of biography, things really stand out. And so that was a watershed book, What is a Gospel? Then several years later, a British scholar named Richard Burridge came up with a book called, it's an homage to Talbert's book, What Are the Gospels? Now that book has won the day. That most New Testament specialists in the world think Burridge nailed it. He also thinks that, in general, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are ancient forms of biographies. And so you have, of course, Matthew, Mark, Luke. I just started writing John as I'm saying the word Luke. Luke, and then, of course, John. So we have Matthew, Mark, and Richard Burridge, and now it's the standard view that all these Gospels, in general, are ancient form of biography. In fact, in Greek, they would have called it a bios. That's where we get the word, it looks like this if you were bios. That's where we get the word biography. But as ancients called it a bios, a bios. A good translation of bios is a life. A life. The life of Jesus. So the Gospels really are lives of Jesus. There are different kinds of biographies in the ancient world. Luke, Acts fits more in a historiography. It's a more formal. Matthew, Mark, and John are also a little different. But they do share in common several features of an ancient biography. But again, I'm not going into a lot of details. I don't know if you care. If you do, go read Richard Burridge's book, and there are other books I can recommend on that. This is a massive study. But I want to give you a heads up that when you read these documents in the ancient world, the standard New Testament view for several decades now is that the Gospels are an ancient form of biography or life. Now, who cares? Well, it actually does matter. If it's an ancient form of life, then the question is, as all genre study is, if it's not apocalypse, if it's not a psalm, if it's not a history book, you might say First Kings, what is a life and what's the purpose of a life? How should we understand it? Well, lives in the ancient world had similarities, and there's some key similarities that help us read the Gospels better. And before I tell you, I just want to make sure, sorry if I'm belaboring the point too much, just remember, the reason why we care about genre or literary type is to figure out what are the right questions to ask of the text. If this is poetry, I don't need to ask what kind of butterfly is it in your stomach. You're asking the wrong question. You can ask it. You're going to get silly answers. Or I'm going to look at you and say, it's the wrong question. Well, who does he think he is? I can read just as much as he can read. You can read butterfly, and you can do. That's not how I interpret it. You don't have to interpret it how you want to. It's just that would it matter to you if I said, it's very likely that butterfly in my stomach, in her stomach, is an idiom because that's poetry. Does it affect at all the questions you're asking? To the average common sense brother, well, yeah, it matters. Whether it's a cookbook or whether it's poetry or it's Stephen King. The same thing is true about an ancient literature. If you'll stop just for a second and say, this isn't Holy Bible, it is. But if you'll skip that for a second and say, what's the genre? Well, they ask the right questions of the text. Okay. So this is common. We do this all the time. One of the key features of a life of someone, and there are a lot of them in the ancient world, Greeks and Romans love to write lives or biographies. There's some similarities to modern biographies, but there are also big dissimilarities. But one of the major things you emphasized in an ancient life was the main character. The main character is always the point. To use literature technical vocabulary, the protagonist. Who is the main dude they're talking about? And it was always a dude, as far as I know. I was always a guy. And I'm saying this because you need to understand that just like other ancient biographies, the Gospels are about one main character. These are not about Israel. The Gospels are not about the disciples. They're not about the earliest followers. They're not about the weather patterns. It's not about what kind of food they ate all the time. It is about Jesus. Jesus is the main character. And if you understand that as a genre, if you find that compelling, and you might not, but and scholars, I do find that compelling, which means, and Burge really helped me see this. I was at an SBL conference when he did a long presentation, and of course I read his book and all that. I think he's exactly right. So instead of, for example, when the disciples don't get Jesus, it was, oh, my dumb disciples, something wrong with them. No, if we read this in the genre, we ask the right question. The question to ask is not, what was wrong with those dumb disciples? The question is, what is it about Jesus that makes him so hard to understand? Do you see the difference? One is, what's wrong with those disciples? Let's reflect a lot more on Peter's boldness, whatever that means, versus, what does it say about Jesus that someone like Peter will respond like that? And when I did How to Read the Bible for What It's Worth, I always beat that drum over and over. It's always good to ask, what does it tell us about God in the Old Testament narrative? What does it tell us about what God's doing in the New Testament? That's a good way to read the Bible. So in biography genre, you always, what does this tell me about the major character, not about the sub-characters? David, does that mean I can never ask the question, what the disciple? No, it doesn't mean you're never going to ask the question. It just means that, if this is true, it means that the authors of the Gospels were not trying to talk much about the disciples. They're just not the point. They're a character in the story. They're different characters in the story. The crowd can be a story. Part of the story is I'll talk, in fact, the sermon this Sunday a little bit more. But the point always is, how does this help us understand Jesus? Or from their view, it's always about the main character. It's always a good question to ask. So in Matthew's a similar way. That means, number two, they chiefly, if not only, tell episodes or stories or sayings or controversies, whatever, that emphasize the main character. This means they are not trying to tell every detail. That's a key difference between the most modern biographies. If I have a modern biography of Winston Churchill, we're going to learn about him and his dog, what his dog ate, when he was born, his cousins, his pet frog's name. I mean, the point is you just kind of spill all out there. I like C.S. Lewis, and you can read biographies about Lewis and where he grew up in Ireland and all this. Or my wife just bought me this little magazine, a special edition on J.R.R. Tolkien. And it's behind the scenes, has pictures of him when he went to World War I, and his friends and where he grew up and the land, and it's all these details. That is not what they did in the ancient world. They would only tell episodes, sayings, and stories to emphasize the main character of the main character, the metal, the character, the inside of the main protagonist. It means, and this is why in scholarship it's very common to call the people who wrote these Gospels editors. Editors, or sometimes they'll call them evangelists. Evangelists, meaning they really are trying to proclaim the gospel. For a lot of, can I have a little, my professor used to say, let me drop a footnote. If I may drop a little footnote, this is usually, in my experience, humbly, one of the most difficult things for the modern average Christian to grasp. Not the first one. They go, oh, I can see that. It's the second one. And it's because, in my experience, and maybe no one in this room or watching online, but in my experience, almost 20 years of ministry has taught me, most Christians think the Gospels really are stenographic courtroom reports of everything that happened in the life of Jesus. Or every conversation that happened is just straight up recording like you had a video camera and someone just watched it on the TV and just wrote down everything that happened. Nobody in scholarship thinks that. Zero people who know anything about scholarship know that, because that's not how the genre functioned. They deliberately, as editors of a newspaper, chose the stories they wanted to write about. And they wrote it in a way and in an order, which I'll go into in a second, that they wanted to write it to make a point about the character so that you got the point they wanted to make. If I want to talk about Susan being so wonderful as a musician and I wrote a life of her, I would only tell those stories that demonstrate sometimes she was spectacular, and sometimes the crowds cheered. Sometimes they didn't understand. Sometimes she was reflective. Sometimes she was this, and sometimes, but I'm trying so hard to get the audience to hear my point of view about you as a musician. And I would deliberately choose stories and put them in the order and so forth I wanted to make the message come across. I'm the editor. I have the freedom to shape the material, and I don't want to use that song. I don't want to use that time. Remember that time when that, no, I don't want to talk about that one. Well, why not bring that one up? Because that doesn't make the point I want to make. Does that make sense? So this is usually the hardest part, but it's just true. There's an enormous amount we do not know about Jesus. We don't know almost anything about his childhood. We have no idea what he looked like. We have no idea what his favorite color was, what he sounded like, whether he joked. I think he did a little bit for a couple reasons, but what he looked like when he was mad. How often did he urinate? What was his favorite food? There's an enormous amount. Who are his friends? See, everyone thinks the apostles were his friends. It never says that. The disciples weren't chosen to be his BFF. The disciples were chosen to be leaders in the church. It never says that. In John's gospel, it says the one whom he loved, his friends. That was Lazarus. That was someone else. But the apostles weren't chosen to be his friends. So most people think, he just picked his buddies. That's not what the Gospels actually say. So my point is, there's so much we just don't know. There's a whole lot of the Gospels that demonstrate Jesus wandered, not wonder with an O, wandered, trying to do that in a good Southern accent, walked around, perambulated, and did things that we just don't know. He just shows up all of a sudden in an episode. He wasn't with the disciples. In the early morning, he went away to go pray. They're on the boat, and all of a sudden, Jesus walked on the water like, they're scared. That's a ghost. But we don't have any clue what Jesus was doing between the last time they saw him and now he's on the water. What was he doing all that time? Why is it in John's gospel, which I get to more in a little bit, why is it in John's gospel is almost completely from a different geographical location, Judea and Jerusalem, while these three gospels are on Galilee? Well, how in the world did Jesus know Lazarus and Mary and Martha? You ever wonder that? That's only in John's gospel. When did he meet him? And the Synoptic Gospels, I'll talk about more in a second. I'm making this point here emphatically because it's usually so difficult for people to grasp. He comes up and says, Peter, James, and John, come follow me. And they go, drop the nets and run. Wow. They must have really saw glory about the guy. Well, maybe. Most scholars don't think that's what happened at all. Jesus grew up with these dudes. He knew them. Their parents knew each other. It's in a small fishing community. So Mark, Matthew, and Luke just jump into the point when his ministry begins. There's a whole bunch we don't know. They could have camped out and had fish for 15 years, and then all of a sudden it picks up on an episode, and they dropped their nets and followed him. But everyone assumes they're strangers until that point. There's no reason to assume that. You only assume they're strangers if you don't notice an ancient genre biography. If you assume it's a stenographic record of everything that ever happened, you'll assume they're strangers. There's a whole bunch we just don't know. And we don't know because they chose not to put it in there. And if you don't believe that, again, just read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then go read John and see how much is so different. There's a lot we just don't know. That's not because they don't love God. It's not because they're trying to be deceptive. It's because that is perfectly acceptable in a genre. You're trying to make the audience get the point, the sermon that you really want them to get. And so you pick and choose the stories you want. The third thing that's characteristic of the ancient genre is they don't care much at all about chronology. They have no problem moving episodes wherever they want to move it to. Stories and sayings, they can move that junk where they want. I want to learn all about Chelsea and her rise to fame. Let's start at the end. When she was 98, she was on her deathbed. And then she said, in flashback, she's 32. Flashback, she's 17. Now she's 70. Now she's... In movies, well, that's really cool, it gets our attention. Well, that's what they did in the ancient world. They don't care about chronology. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus overturns the money changer's temple at the very end of his ministry. It's the thing that causes him to be arrested and then killed. In John's Gospels, in John chapter 2, it's the first thing of his ministry. Now you can say, well, there are two different events. That's possible. It's also possible that the genre, that they don't care at all where the chronology went. I'll go back in a sec. I'll say more about that in a little bit. So these are some, again, today that's very different typically when you write a biography. Like I just said, C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, the books, the magazines will start at the beginning. Lewis was born in 1893 in Dublin, Ireland, where he was born. The main character is always the main point. They're going to tell the episode stories and sayings that they want to emphasize. Chronology doesn't matter much at all. And another thing is, and I'll move on after this, most lives or biographies, and certainly the Gospels, were intended, this is controversial, for a wide audience. For about a long time, a century, a lot of people still it's still pretty popular to believe that the Gospels were written from and for a local audience. That was the dominant view of New Testament studies. The last couple of decades, because of, I'm sorry, I don't know how much nerd detail to give you or not. The last couple of decades, there was a book written as a collection of essays by Richard Burge and others, British scholars, who argued, nope, it was written from a local community, but not for a local community. It was written from a local community, but it's supposed to go out to the wide world very quickly. So they don't deny that a local church helped form it. The new way to think about it is, for a lot of reasons, I think very good reasons, is it wasn't written just for the local community. It's not that Dennis said, I want to write a life of Jesus just for us, and we're going to hug it. It's going to be our particular work of literature that we use in worship and discipleship all the time. That was the dominant view of gospel studies for at least 100 years. But now, the standard view is, I think it's safe to say standard. It's certainly what I find compelling, for a lot of reasons, to save you time, is that it did arise from within a community. So a Matthean community, a Markan community, a church. If you don't like the word community, put the word church. So Dennis writes his a gospel that came out of the first Christian church, but he wrote it to be disseminated widely to every church down the street and to every town he can get it to. To the world, basically to their world. That's exactly right. And this is much, much more accepted today. The best SBO conference I'd ever been to was a presentation and debate on this issue. And man, that was awesome. It was a packed standing room only. Oh man, that was good stuff. That was a good one. Because that book had come out a few years ago, no one really took it seriously. And so the panel discussion was almost all the authors of the book. And one or two people took them all on. And Margaret Mitchell from University of Chicago, she was great. It was fun. Good nerd stuff. Yes. Yes, sir.
Oh, I was
I'm just repeating it to make sure that they can't hear it too well unless I repeat it. Dennis, that's a very astute observation. One of the arguments made for a local community is that the documents, and we'll go there in a little bit, the documents themselves are anonymous. It doesn't say written by Matthew, written by Mark. Those titular designations come later, but they're early, but they're not the earliest manuscripts we have. And it's probably the case that they were anonymous on the documents because the local communities knew exactly who wrote it. It wasn't until it traveled somewhere else and they began getting collected, and then they said, well, whose is this? Well, that's the gospel. And literally in Greek, it's kata markon, according to Mark. It doesn't say Mark wrote it, it says according to Matthew, according to Mark, because it's the gospel. And so its distribution to probably force the hand to say, you got to write down who wrote this thing. And that's debated who wrote it. We'll go there in just a second. But yeah, that's good. So these are general understandings. So, and we could go on, we could list other things if you want, but I just want to move ahead. Any question or comments about that? I do want to move ahead. I did want to do this before we just jump into Matthew 1:1. Okay, very quickly. Some of you know this, some of you don't. If you don't be ashamed. If you do, bear with me for a second, because I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very common. There's two Greek words. He said, Professor, the same one who said drop a footnote, he said, it comes from two Greek words, as all good words do. He said, synoptic means seen together. We call these I don't really care what you call them, but if I throw this term out there, synoptic gospels, seen together gospels. Well, who gives a rip? The point is, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very common. One of the first things I remember when I was younger, a teenager, when I really started reading the New Gospel, I thought, this is boring. They all sound the same. I'd never known that until I started reading. John is an odd stinking bird. He's the apple that fell well off the tree. He's his own little beast. He's just different. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus' ministry is chiefly around Galilee, chiefly around there. John's gospel, he's chiefly around Judea, down the south in Jerusalem, Judea/Jerusalem. And John's gospel, Jesus goes to the Passover in Jerusalem at least 3 times, which would make it at least a 2-year ministry. Everyone says 3 years, but that's anyway. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus talks more mysteriously. He talks about, he gives a lot of parables. John gives no parables. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus gives a lot of exorcisms and miracles. In John's gospel, he gives 7, and they're not called miracles, they're called signs, and they're always called signs. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus talks a lot about the kingdom of God. John's gospel, Jesus talks about himself. On and on, me, all day long. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus can say things that imply he has some divine prerogative. He forgives sins. He will judge. He is Lord of the Sabbath. In John's gospel, ain't nothing implicit about it. Before Abraham was, I am. All those I am statements come only from John. So when you read them, they're quite different in the way they talk. Now, if you want, we can talk about that. Otherwise, I'm just going to move on. But there are distinctions. So if you haven't read your Gospels yet, just understand, when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're going to sound similar, and John's going to sound quite different. And if that bothers you, let's talk. Because that's an old, let me rephrase that. We can talk because it's actually not that problematic. For people who are not used to that, it is. But I'm saying I can encourage you. So if you come talk, we can encourage you, and it's not that scary after all. Okay? Any question about that? Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Yes, sir. And I'm going to do more about that in just a second. Yes, sir. I thought you had your hand up. Yes, ma'am.
Is Mark considered to have been written first? A lot of Mark is quoted, almost all of Mark is quoted in the other books.
That's very good. That's about to go next. There are 2 theories of why in the world they're so similar. There's multiple theories. And to save you, again, technical jargon like the grease spot hypothesis and all this stuff, I'm just going to keep pretty simple. There are 2 leading theories of how the Gospels got written. And it goes like this. Jesus preaches and teaches. His sermons and his talks get memorized by his disciples, and some by the crowds, and certainly by the people he healed. And the leading theory now by people like Richard Bauckham and others, and I think it's very good, is that the actual story, the stories of the healings, with those names attributed, like in Mark 10, Bartimaeus got healed, the blind beggar. Bauckham and others argue the reason why Bartimaeus' name is mentioned is because Bartimaeus told the story. And there's a lot of instances like that. Luke 24, it's Cleopas and the partner who's on the road to Damascus. Well, who's the partner's name? Bauckham and others argue you don't have it because who told the story probably? Cleopas. And so the story gets attributed to that person's name if they tell the story. You have the story in Mark chapter 11 now? I'm trying to confusing. With a woman that comes in and she pours alabaster jar, this nardos, usually translated, that they just give it nard, there's some oil, perfume. Disciples fuss at her, that could have been sold for a lot of money. He says, leave her alone. Which I would have said the same thing, like this woman's gone crazy. Don't you want to help the poor, Jesus? Don't you listen to your own preaching? He said, leave her alone, because she is anointing my body basically before burial. And then he says, and wherever the gospel is preached, she will be spoken of. We have no idea what her name is. We have no idea what her name is. Probably because she didn't tell the story. It's just the disciples remember that time. Remember that time, that woman? Remember that time? So these oral traditions and preaching, which he probably did preach over and over similar topics over and over. So it's not crazy to think he taught the model prayer twice or multiple times. Matthew and Luke have two different versions. He preached it, got memorized. He healed people, exorcised demons. They told her, went back home, did you hear what happened? You hear what happened? Dude was blind and this and then whatever. She had 12 demons. Remember that time? And these stories promulgated, and for a couple decades, churches were formed after he died and resurrected. Right away, they started worshiping his name, praising, on and on. This oral tradition kept being used in the church service. They'd stand up, read some Old Testament text. Someone stand up, Crystal will stand up. I got another story. There was this one time I heard him on the side of the Sea of Galilee. And they tell these stories over and over in worship, over and over and over and over and over, for a couple decades. Then the issue is, when did it start getting written down? This is debated. Almost certainly it didn't happen before around AD 60. And there's Paul, the Apostle Paul, died in early 60s, around 62. And he mentions nothing about the Gospels whatsoever. There's not even any inkling of it. Well, that's possible they still existed. It's just more unlikely. And there's a lot of reasons, I don't have much time. There's a lot of reason to think the Gospels weren't written by then. It probably did get started in the 50s with Mark, but it probably didn't get finished between 60 to 70 AD. And so the very first Gospel that most scholars think was written was Mark. Most scholars think Mark was written. Not every, but that's by far the consensus. I'd say 95% of scholars think Mark. We call this Markan priority, that Mark got written first. And then I want to ask you permission if I can say a little nerd talk here. There's a guy, well, because maybe you never heard this before, and I want to make sure you hear this at least once in your life, okay? There's a church historian, his name is Eusebius. He writes in the 4th century. This won't help you be more like Jesus, so just interesting fun facts, okay? Eusebius is a church historian. He writes about a guy named Papias. Probably how they pronounce it, I'm not sure. Papias was a bishop in Hierapolis, which is in Asia Minor, Turkey. And Papias lived right around, let's say, around the 110s AD. So this is early, stinking early. Well, we don't have any of Papias's documents, and that stinks. We don't have any of his letters, his books, his sermons, nothing. All we have is what Eusebius, 300 years later, tells us what Papias wrote. Eusebius has some copies, but we don't have what he had. We don't have any extant manuscripts. That's a bummer. There's a lot we don't have. But Eusebius says that Papias says. That's exactly right. Good. You're tracking with me. He said, she said, he said. Papias has some good quotes. And I won't read the whole quote for you, but one of it is two things that are really important. Papias says that Jonas Marcus, John Mark, that's his real Jonas Marcus, John Mark, I call him Mark for short, that Mark traveled with Peter and was his, there's debate on how to, it's irony, how to interpret the word, the interpreter. He was his interpreter. Does that mean his translator? Or does it mean something like interpreter is someone who explains it? Explainer guy. Like, this is what he really meant. Many people think it means something like maybe a little both, but more like translator. Eusebius says that Papias says that Peter and Mark knew each other, and Mark traveled with Peter and got Peter's firsthand recollections, and he was his interpreter. I think, personally, it's a little both. I think it certainly means translator. I think it's because Peter's primarily spoke in what language? Aramaic. So Peter's mother tongue is Aramaic. Now, Peter would have known some Greek, but Marcus, a good Roman name, his real name is Jonas Marcus, Mark knew his Greek. So he translated, basically. So Mark said, Pete, talk to me, brother. They went to church together, he heard stories, and John Mark wrote it down. But what Papias says is that Mark didn't care much about the order. He said he put them basically in whatever order he wanted to put them in. But if you read Mark, you notice that's exactly what happens. We have no idea what day it is, what time it is. He just tells, Mark 4 is a bunch of parables of seeds and soil. He just shoves it all together in one, but everyone thinks it's a parable chapter. And so if the average Christian now goes, wow, Jesus was on a roll. He just preached on sow seed after seed after seed after seed, because that's the assumption that the gospel writers are simply writing a story of a stenographic record of everything he said when he said it. But again, in scholarship study, no one thinks that. Instead, Mark deliberately, as a life writer, biography writer, put all in what we call one chapter. Matthew 5 through 7, we call the Sermon on the Mount. Nobody in scholarship thinks Jesus really said all those things back to back to back to back to back, but Matthew instead has made it a quote-unquote sermon, one long body of material. And we think a theological reason why he did it. He wants him to sound like Moses when Moses gives his farewell discourse in Deuteronomy. So Eusebius says, Papias says, Mark and Pete chatted, wrote a gospel. Papias also says something about Matthew. That's where I'm going with this. He says that, can I move on? Can I erase this? Okay, no extra charge for that. He says that Matthew, and this is where it's confusing. He says Matthew, he references the gospel written, he calls it basically Hebraic, or the Hebrew gospel. So, Matthew was not written in Hebrew, it's written in Greek. And scholars for a while tried to translate backwards to see if there are Hebraisms. Doesn't work. So basically no scholar thinks today at all that Matthew was written on a Hebrew original and translated to Greek. No one thinks that anymore. I mean, in general, they don't. And it's not in Hebrew, it's clearly in Greek, because I'm looking at the Greek right in front of me. It's in Greek. So what do we do with that? Some said, this is what some scholars say, Papias just wrong. Bless his heart, he's just wrong. He got wrong tradition. Others say, no, it's one key word he says. That Papias says it was written in the Hebrew, you know this word, it's just Greek, and you didn't know that. Dialectos. What do you think it means? Dialectos, what? Dialect. Well, the dialect today means language, like a dialect of a certain language. But there are scholars who've argued, if you look at the word dialectos in the ancient world, dialectos is not about the language spoken, but about the rhetorical style used. The rhetorical style used. If that's true, Papias is not saying it was written in the Hebrew tongue, Hebrew language. It was written in the Hebrew style. That's really intriguing because Papias goes on to say, unlike Mark, that is not in order, Matthew writes in the Hebrew dialectos. And he says, and he puts in a particular order. So other scholars argue Papias isn't just wrong or mistaken or a dummy. He's deliberately saying Matthew's text is much more in order on purpose. He's ordered it on purpose. My own personal view is I think it's exactly the way to understand it. I think that fits the data the best. I don't think he means he wrote in the Hebrew gospel, though that is possible. I think he thinks it's rhetorical. And that is to say, and it's just true. Matthew, no matter how you look at the division, there's blocks of material. Mark is not like that. Okay. I'm going to move on past that. And then there's Luke and John. Okay, let me go back to the original question that Jana asked, and you're still waiting for an answer to your question, aren't you? Okay, most scholars think Mark was written first. So the oral tradition, and finally someone said, let's write a life down. The tradition is, which we don't know past Papias, maybe it's all lied and confused, or it's telling the truth, that Mark's gospel, Mark was not a disciple of Jesus. He'd have been a young man when that happened. That later on, he grew up and hung out with Pete, and then wrote a gospel story down, which is real intriguing because it's not the most popular gospel in the ancient church. The most popular gospel in the ancient church is the second one that was probably written. Sorry, probably the second one written, and that's Matthew. Matthew is the most popular gospel. Probably for various reasons. Did you say why? That was Vanna. Like, man, that's good ventriloquism. Her mouth is completely shut. She's going, yes, why? I'm like, that is impressive. We don't know for sure. We just don't. Probably a few reasons scholars posit. One is because it's so full. If you read the teaching and the sayings of Jesus, it's one of the fullest, certainly fuller than Mark. Secondly, it's the most quote-unquote Jewish of the Gospels. And for an early Jewish Christian movement, it really appeals to them. Another reason is simply because the communities to whom it was written were much more stable than some of the other ones. And so it got cherished more and repeated more and copied more. That's also possible. So we just have to throw out those reasons. We're not exactly sure why. I think probably all those. Also, Matthew has the most connection with the Old Testament than the other four Gospels. So I tend to think it's that Jewishness that made it the most popular, because the earliest Christian movement for several decades, if you were to walk into the average church, or they would call it gathering, ecclesia, community, let's say Jesus died you'll see this in the newsletter coming up. We know exactly, almost certainly when he died. It was on, I'm going to spare you the suspense. You're on my cover. I gave you the exact date that he probably died on. Either in AD 30 or AD 33. And then the 50s, 60s, 70s, by the time the Gospel's probably written between 20 to 30 years before Mark is written. 20, 30 years. So as long as you've been alive, almost, all that time period, the oral tradition has been passing on and passing on and passing on. But in those first several decades, it was dominated by Jews. So if you'd walk into the average first Christian church between the AD 30 to 50 or 60, you'd have met a lot of Jews in church, not Gentiles. They did start creeping in early on, but that was mostly in other towns outside of Israel. You had to go to Berea and Ephesus and others. Then they're still Jews, but then it starts tipping toward Gentile land. But in the motherland of Israel, it's dominated by Jews. And that's almost certainly where Matthew was written, which is which I'll go into a second. I'll say right now is we're not sure where, probably written in Syria. And maybe I'll tell you why in a second. So the dominant theory is Mark's written, then Matthew's written, and then Luke is written. And then we have no clue when John was written. We just don't. Most scholars think it's dead last. There's one problem with this theory. Well, several. One is we don't know for sure. We just don't know for sure. But I do think this is how it happened. Personally, John, I go back and forth and back and forth. Here's the deal. Very quickly, and we're going to move on, okay? About 93 to 98% of Mark is used in Matthew and Luke. Let's keep it even, say 93% of Mark shows up. That's a chunk. That's a big chunk into Matthew, right? And Luke's the same way. Luke is longer. It's the longest. But if you have Mark, Matthew, and Luke, there are times, stay with me here, there are times forget John for a second, because he's that apple that fell off the tree. Mark, Matthew, and Luke are similar. There are times when Matthew and Luke have stories, sayings, data. They have in common that's not in Mark. And sometimes they have things in common that disagrees with Mark. Well, how do you explain that? What the leading theory has been for about 150 years is they must have had another written document. How is that Matthew and Luke can have things word for word in common that's not in Mark? If they use Mark, which they did, how do they go word for word unless they're not looking at the exact same document? Now you look at it. Now, decades later or something. And so they came up with a theory, scholars did, that there must have been this hypothetical written source, which we don't have anymore, and they called it from the German word Quelle. They call it Q. I don't care what it's called, but it's this hypothetical early sayings document that must have, if it existed, it was written down within a few years of Jesus' death and resurrection. And it's primarily about the sayings of Jesus. Primarily recording the sayings of Jesus. So the leading theory in scholarship for well over 100 years is that Mark informed Matthew, and so did Q. And then Luke used Q and he used Mark as well. Is that too confusing? And then what about John? Forget him, he's Oddbird.
Thinking ancient game of telephone.
Kind of ancient telephone. Kind of like the telephone, except this would be written, unlike oral. That's kind of like
Dual
that.
relationship database.
Dual relation, yeah, in fact, this is called the two-source hypothesis. You call it dual relation database. Okay, this theory is still the dominant view, and it has fallen on hard times. It's hard times, bless its heart. And there is, for example, one guy, he teaches at Duke, I love him. His name is Mark Goodacre, he's British. He has a great, I can't even do his accent, it's just a pristine, perfect British accent. He and others just attack the snot out of Q and say, y'all have gone crazy. Q does not exist. We have no evidence for it. It's all hypothetical. And he says, his scholars say, no. It's like this. It's just like this. That's it. And that those things where they're similar, it means Luke used Matthew. Now, it doesn't explain everything. You've got some difficulties, but this is growing in popularity to get rid of Q. So if I were presenting a paper right now, I'd say, well, Q, if Q exists, if I were a scholar, So in a nutshell, those are two major theories, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and then John. But everyone agrees Matthew and Luke use Mark. Do Luke get Matthew filtered from Mark? And that's what's debated. And one quick thing. Well, David, what about, there are stories only in Matthew. There are stories that are only in Luke. For example, I don't know if you know this. For example, you don't have to right now, go to Luke 15 one time. It's the lost chapter, not really. It's the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son, which is called the prodigal son. It shouldn't call that. Anyway, all lost stuff. That only shows up in Luke 15. My PhD had a class on the uniquely Lucan parables. Those parables only show up in Luke. I did Luke 12. One of the parables in Luke 12. Well, where does he get this information? If Luke didn't get it from Matthew and didn't get it from Mark, where did Luke get these stories from? Well, you said Q. The only problem with Q is Q is the letter used only for the material that Matthew and Luke have in common. So if it's uniquely Lucan, and what we call that unique material, this is very clever, we just call that L.
James. He got it from James.
Matthew has the same story in the Sermon on the Mount, all kinds of stuff. Now, Luke 6 has a lot of the Sermon on the Mount, but some things only Matthew has. We call that M. So technically speaking, Matthew used Mark and some other stories. Luke probably used Matthew and certainly used Mark, maybe Q. No matter what your view of Q is, they still have unique material. No matter what your view of Q is, they still have unique material. And John's got tons of unique material. We'll just call it J for John. John, he's just got tons of unique material that shows up nowhere else. What's interesting, a little footnote, there's only one story that shows up in all four Gospels. You know what it is? The feeding of the multitude. All four Gospels. And it's in John's Gospel, it talks about the grass being green and some other stuff, and that's kind of cool because when you put these together, it actually helps inform the story and its historical reliability. It's the only story that shows up all four. Well, David, where does M and L come from? Why did Luke tell the prodigal son? Did he just make it up? Well, the answer is, well, no. What most scholars have said for 150, 200 years is the community in which it was written. The stories came from a church. And so they had stories that no other church had. And so by the time Dennis goes right down his gospel, the gospel of Jesus according to Dennis, there are stories that only Janet knew. Why? Because she was there. And that only Krista knows, so he's got inside scoop. He also has the written document of Mark, and maybe Matthew too, but when he goes to write his own document, he's got stories no one else knew about. And then when that gets copied and passed on to other churches, they go, oh, look at there. I didn't know these stories. And what happens in the manuscript tradition is some of these stories get moved from gospel to gospel because they know them in their mind, they hear them in church service all the time, they move it. One example is in the Gospel of John. This is one of the most earth-shattering, sad things for people when they learn this fact. The woman caught in adultery in John 7:53 through 8:11. That almost certainly was not originally to John. There are other manuscripts where that story is in Luke. Other manuscripts. So anyway, that's another story. Don't lose your faith tonight on that. Please don't. Okay, so this is probably when they were written. And I'm going to go ahead.
So it wouldn't.
Please.
It wouldn't have,
Well, and Luke. No, very good question. The question is, if I can rephrase it just a little bit, tell me if I've gotten you wrong. won't some of the distinctions of the Gospels be explained by the fact that they have different audiences? Absolutely, stinking-lutely. That's what most scholars say. So, for example, in Matthew, there are several things that occur in Matthew that are Jewish customs that he does not explain. And most scholars assume it's because the audience would have understood what those concepts were. He talks about the drachma, whatever, the temple tax. Well, unless you're a Jew, no, Gentiles don't have a clue what that thing is. They don't go to the temple to give a tax. But if you read Mark's gospel, he'll explain things. For example, in Mark's gospel, and Jesus in prayer, remember the prayer in Gethsemane? In Mark, it's just the region of Gethsemane. In Matthew, it's called the garden. So we stick with the garden. And what does he call him? His father, he calls him what? Abba?
Good place to be.
Remember the prayer? What does he say? Talk to me. Remember he says, and Jesus said?
Abba, Father.
Father. He says, Abba, Father. Well, probably not. Abba is Aramaic. Guess what Abba means? It means father. So in Greek, it says Abba Pater. I'm sorry, I know you don't care about that, but anyway, Abba Pater. The word pater is the word father. It's a corruption of the word. But so when you say father, you're really just saying a corrupted Greek word. Now, why would he say that? Why would he translate it? Because the audience is Greek speaking. They don't know what Abba means. And in Galatians, when Paul says, and the Spirit cries in our hearts as being adopted as sons, and we cry out to him and cry out as Abba, and he's speaking to Gentiles, it shows Jesus called God Abba. Why in the world would that word of all the words stick in the tradition so much that Paul won't even translate it sometimes? He'll just say Abba, because that's what the Lord said. So you have these times where in the Gospels it's translated. It'll say, this was because. Mark's Gospel, the Pharisees fuss the disciples because they don't wash their hands. Mark will explain why. He'll say, well, it's because they cared about ritual purity, da-da-da-da. It's his parentheses. And that's probably because his audience is primarily Gentile. Most scholars think Mark was written more in Rome. And that's why.
Was Abba considered formal?
Was Abba more personal and Father more formal? No, ma'am. That's a good question. Now, as far as in other studies, Abba is kind of like Daddy. It wasn't weird for Jews to use Abba corporately. It was weird for a Jew to call God Abba. So using Abba is not weird. Using Abba as an individual stance is weird. Jews didn't talk that way.
But he was the son.
Well, that's one reason in studies, if I were teaching a class on the gospel presentation of Jesus, I would say all the way back to kind of Joachim Jeremias, he makes this point. He says, it's one of the distinctive points that in Jesus' own ministry, he assumed that he had a relationship with the Father other Jews did not have. He kind of went so far to say that it was unique in the ancient world. Scholars since Jeremias said, no, it's not unique. He went too far. No. Jews could talk that way, and they could talk that way. But Jeremias is right that one-on-one, that a person calls it versus in corporate prayer, we call you Abba. That's more common. But Jesus didn't say that much. He seemed to call them all right on. So that's interesting that it seems to be, it's idiosyncratic, if not unique. Sort of Matthew. I'll move on to Matthew. There's no other questions? So Matthew was we don't know when it's written. They are anonymous documents and all that, so we don't know when it was written. It all comes down to one simple thing, Susan, as it usually does. The fact is, and we won't go there right now, we're going to go there several weeks from now. What do you do with Jesus' prediction of the destruction of the temple? That's straight from Mark 13, but in Matthew, it's Matthew 24. And he predicts the destruction of the temple. Forever, scholars said, there's no way he could have really predicted, which means this had to have happened after the temple really fell. I'll say that one more time. So in Matthew 24, Mark 13, if Jesus predicts the fall of the temple, and we all know that did happen in AD 70, and if there's no way Jesus could have predicted that, therefore the Gospels must have been written after AD 70. That's how the logic goes. What's the only problem with that? Is it conceivable that Jesus really could have predicted the fall of the temple? Even if you're a Satan worshiper, is it conceivable that Jesus could have thought that the temple ain't going to make it? The fact is, yes. We know that at the Dead Sea, heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls before? There was a community there called at the Qumran. Sometimes we call them the Essenes. There's a community of Jews And these Essenes thought the same thing. We know that because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. They thought the temple was hopelessly corrupt and judgment's coming. They predicted that junk all the time. Jesus never said what year it's going to happen. He just said it's going to happen. In fact, he even said some of you won't taste death before it happens. This generation won't pass away until these things happen. He was right. So if you go the one path to say there's no way he could have predicted that, well, if that's the case, then the Gospels have to come after, maybe 70 plus after. If you think it's possible he did in fact predict it, well, then the date's off the table. Then the issue is, how likely is it that Paul never even alludes to a gospel in his ministry? The Apostle Paul wrote his letters first, AD. First Thessalonians is probably first, around AD 51. So why is it all through the 50s to about 62 when he died, 50s to early 60s, he never mentions it? So most scholars think Mark was written around AD 70. I think they're wrong. And there's a smaller group of scholars who think Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and maybe John all predate the fall of the temple. That's not the consensus. It's a minority group. I tend to go in that way. I think all of them are written in the 60s, I think. But anyway, there you go. But if I ask a standard average New Testament scholar, when were the Gospels written? This is what they're going to say. They're going to say, Mark was written around AD 70. Matthew was written around 75 to 80. Luke was written around 85-ish. And they're going to say John was written around 90. This is standard scholarship. I think they're wrong, but this is standard scholarship.
And the introduction agrees with you, 60 to 65 for Matthew.
What kind of Bible is that?
NIV.
Yeah, that's why. Yeah, the NIV Study Bible. Yeah, it's a conservative group of scholars who put that together. That's why Zondervan put that together. So they're conservative. Only conservative, typically. I don't like labels, but typically only conservative scholars. I don't like the label because it sounds like they can only have that view because they're conservative. I don't find that compelling. I guess I'm pretty conservative. I don't have a theological view that makes me have that conclusion. I don't find the arguments compelling for a late date. That's why I don't find it compelling. I don't care if you're conservative, liberal, man, woman, girl, dog. It doesn't matter. I think that. But this is standard. There you go. So just for fun, let's say Matthew was around 87. What's that?
65. ESV is the same way.
ESV is also a very conservative group. Yeah, ESV, NIV, that's right. Yeah. If you have any Bible that says before 70, I'm telling you that's a conservative team of editors. Guarantee it. Yeah. Guarantee, yeah. I just guarantee it. Where was Matthew written? We don't have a clue. All kinds of options have been thrown out there. But the dominant theory is this. And you look on your map in your Bible app or whatever, the dominant, I think if there is a consensus, it was in Antioch, Syria. Antioch, Syria. Why? A couple of reasons. One is because we know there was a large Jewish community in Antioch, Syria. We know that in the first century. That matters because Matthew is by far the heaviest Jewish or alluding to Jewish scriptures. We know there's a large Jewish community there, so that would make sense that a very Jewish gospel's in a Jewish community. Another reason is because we know that from the book of Acts, is it Acts 16? I'm going by memory now. All this is by memory. Anyway, the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul, he does missionary work, and in Antioch, Syria, there's a large group of I'm sorry if this is all new to you, but I'm going pretty fast. Hellenized Jews. And what that means is these are Jews who are, Hellenized means Greekized. Greekized is all that means. That is, they speak Greek. They know some Greek culture. What? Paganized. You said paganized. Jews who lived in Jerusalem and Israel would absolutely agree with you. They don't like that junk. In the early church, when the Hellenized Jews get converted and come back home to the Jerusalem church, Jewish Christians and Hellenized Jewish Christians don't get along that well because they don't speak the mother tongue that well. They speak Greek So anyway, we know in Antioch there's that. Well, that would make sense because Matthew is written in Greek and it's very, very Jewish. That's Hellenized and Jewish. That makes a lot of sense. So there's a normal Jewish community from which converts would come. That's another thing. And we know this because of the book of Acts, like I said.
So he lived in Antioch, Syria?
He lived, and we do not know where he lived. If you go with the theory that the Gospels arise out of a community, like a church, a local church that produced the gospel, if you go with that theory, then the question is, where was the church located? Was it in Lawrence or Austin, Texas, or whatever? And they were saying it's located out. And another reason why they think it's probably from Syria, maybe Antioch. We know Antioch's a big city, but Syria is because there are other documents, there are other Syrian documents from the time period that sure sound like Matthew. And we're almost certain they come from Syria. And when it sounds very much like Matthew, it makes most historians, and I'm one, would argue, it makes more sense that it sounds similar because it must have been written in the same town. If I wrote a document and I allude to KU and the Jayhawks or whatever, and I find another document that alludes to the Jayhawks and KU, it's more likely it was written in Lawrence than it is in Albuquerque or New York because I'm referencing the same thing or emphasize the same points. If I use, like I've learned here in Lawrence, everyone uses liberal. So if I said that every other word, must have been written in Lawrence because you don't hear that word in Houston because there's such a wide spectrum of everything anyway. And for example, one of the documents is called the Didache. The Didache means teaching. And it's the earliest church manual we have. How do you do baptisms? How do you do the Lord's Supper? In fact, the Didache is where they call the Eucharist.
I thought that's what you were going to call the Q document.
Oh, the Q, the Didache?
When you first started.
Gotcha. And you can read the Didache. It's translated. It's a short document. I used to have it in my Bible, in the back of it, the part of the communion, because every once in a while in my previous church, I would actually read that from the Didache. And this was written probably by the end of the first century. And it's in I drop a little footnote here. The Didache is where we have, they're reaching out to go into all nations to make disciples. And many scholars think that tagline on Matthew 28, go therefore all the world, is actually from the Didache, the popularity of the Didache. Anyway, but we know that's Syrian, and there's some theology represented. It sure sounds and smells like Matthew, so they say they might have been written around the same community. And we don't know, but I think that is likely. So we don't know for sure. Don't take it to the bank, but this does make sense. So when, we're not sure, let's say the 70s, just to be fun, Antioch, Syria, it certainly is a Jewish community. It certainly is. This would have made no sense to a heavy Gentile audience, all this, and then thus fulfills the scripture. Like, what are you talking about? And certainly it was a Greek-speaking Jewish audience because it's written in Greek. So that's not thoroughgoing Palestine. That's got to be someone on a little bit outskirts of the motherland. I think that's all I want to say about that before we talk about Matthew. We'll get finished because the first part of Matthew goes fast. Yeah.
So why do they think groups?
That's a very good question. Why do they think they're structured in church groups to write them versus independent? Very good question. We don't know for certain, but historically it makes the most sense. One is because almost certainly, as I said, the oral tradition that was repeated because of Jesus' ministry happened within the context only of churches. So individual loners didn't run out to the desert and tell stories about Jesus. They told fellow disciples that and tried to preach and get more converts and told more disciples. Now, the oral traditions of Jesus were used chiefly for discipleship. And don't forget what Jesus said. We got to do this. So it was used within a community of worship. And we know that because of Paul's letters. Paul writes to churches, the churches of Corinth, the churches in Rome, the churches of whatever. And he'll even allude to, and don't forget, like what Jesus said. In Mark 10, he quotes, directly about the Lord's Supper, and he'll go on and on for a while. That's not controversial. They know what the teachings of Jesus is on the communion. And it's the earliest record we have. It shows up later in the Gospels in a little different forms. So it does make the most sense that the earliest communities are where they repeated the stories over and over. Then the question is, doesn't it make the most sense that a gospel which talks about those stories came from a community already telling the stories?
They're kind of affiliated with that.
They're affiliated with that worshiping congregation, almost certainly. So it just makes the most sense that versus like a desert. We don't have much evidence of Christians living on their own anyway. They were in chiefly some urban and rural areas. The other thing is, yes, it did cost money. That's a good point so the question is, how do these get funded? We're not sure. The only indication we have of any of the Gospels is the Gospel of Luke. What's Luke Acts? Luke wrote Luke Acts. We don't know how many years took place before he wrote the second volume, but he did write these together. In the very beginning, he writes to Theophilus. I can't do this while I'm talking. Theophilus, which means God lover, lover of God. He was probably the patron who paid for it. Luke Acts is massive. That would have been a massive, massive Harry Potter series. I mean, this thing would have been huge in the ancient world. But Mark and Matthew and John, Mark, Matthew, and John, we don't know how they got the money for it. It is likely that some local church patrons paid for it. The wealthy in the community almost certainly helped. It would cost a lot of money, the materials alone and going around and getting information. So several things like that make it more likely. But we're just not sure. It also helps explain why they are, as Dennis alluded to, it also explains why there's some idiosyncrasies, some theological nuances and lenses through which they see it that they were trying to encourage the people. For example, in Matthew's text and in John's too, in Matthew's, every time he says synagogue, it's not his synagogue. It's their synagogue. Their synagogue. So whomever his audience is, they are at a breach between the local Jews and themselves. I'll say Christians, that's XTNS. It's their synagogue, not our synagogue. Now, I think they probably were Jews, but there's a breach going on. In John's gospel, it's worse. In John's gospel, the Jews have their father as Satan. I mean, it's horrible. There's a massive schism. There's a massive schism in John's gospel. Again, that makes more sense instead of a lone writer out there talking about it, it makes more sense that there's a community that is really trying to be encouraged by these things because they're struggling. And I'm sure there are more reasons, but on the fly, it's probably the best I got. Feel free. Okay, let's get going. Matthew 1:1. In the next 20 minutes, we'll cover as much ground as we can. We're not going to read all this for several reasons, because of time, but also because I did some of this at the birth of Jesus, and I'm not going to repeat all that. But in a nutshell, he starts at the beginning, 1:1, the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, so Jesus Christ, the son of David, son of Abraham. I'm going to emphasize a few key things here. One is genealogy sets up what's about to take place as the origin story, as it were. Genealogies in the ancient world served a very important function. We don't like them. They're nice and boring to us, but genealogies are important. It starts out great and gets drilled down. And that is a lot of things. Genealogies in both Greeks, Romans, and Jews showed pedigree. If you're going to be a king, you've got to show where you came from. You have to. We don't think that way because in America, we don't have kings. Who gives a rep? But you understand, even British, right? Who's heir to the throne? That does matter. It matters for taxation purposes. It does matter whether or not you pay more or less. It matters when it comes to your inheritance. You have to demonstrate who you're related to make sure you're getting what's going to be yours. And all these things matter. If you're a Jew, it certainly can show God's involvement in the history to lead up to this point. So they're boring to me, but to the ancient world, to set up the fact, listen, that he is the son of David. Son of David, by this time period, had taken on a technical meaning, basically of king. From a lot of texts, but particular from 2 Samuel 7, where he promises someone from the line of David will sit on the throne forever. Then the Babylonian exile happened. They all got destroyed. Well, what happened there? Well, the Jews didn't give up the hope. They kept saying, it's still going to happen. Isaiah comes in Isaiah 11. I preached on this here, in fact. A shoot from the trunk of Jesse will come. And so this promise of God's going to deliver on his promise. Someone from the line of David is going to come. So not his literal or biological son, but they use sonship as one who's heir to the throne. Heir to the throne. So don't let the son part throw you and think it means his literal, like Hayden is to me. But someone from the line of me, a son of David Pendergrass, will come to the throne. Well, in Matthew, this genealogy is his defense, his explanation for why Jesus is this son of David. If you're a Jew, that's really good and cool and fun and important. It's important even if you're not. My point is, they grew up hearing these stories. When is God the Father going to bring us our king from the line of David? And so this long, quote-unquote, boring genealogy for them is exciting because this is the guy we've been waiting on. He's not just the son of David, he's the son of Abraham. So who cares about that? Well, Jews do as well, because in Genesis 22, Abraham makes a covenant with God, and he says, from your loin, basically from your seed will have all kinds of things. I'm going to make royalty come out of your seed, your progeny, your children. You're going to get land. You're going to have so many seeds, it's going to be like the what? The sand on the beach, so the stars of the sky, whatever. You're going to have land and promises and blessing and on and on and on. Well, Abraham was a Gentile. The Jews said, hot dog, we're children of Abraham. But this turned into a promise for the Gentiles coming into God's fold. All of God's people, all over the world. Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. And so they'd say, all because God had made promise. And the Christians said, yep, he came true on his promises. That's Paul's point in Romans 3 and Galatians 3, 4. Romans 4, Galatians 4, is that right? And that's his point, is that God made form. We are also the heirs of Abraham's promise as Gentiles coming to the fold. So that's why he started. Jesus Christ he starts it all off. And if you look at the different generations, verses 2 to 6 is 14 generations. 6 to 11 is 14 generations. 12 to 16 is 13 generations. Why is he doing that? Why is it 14, 14, and 13? Those of you who took Revelation know a little bit about numbers by this point. Let's just do the math real quickly. 2 to 6 is 14 generations. That's 2 sevens. 6 to 11 is 14 generations. That's another sevens. 12 to 16 is 13 generations. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're still missing that last number to make it perfect. Where does it end up? Look at verse 17. So all the generations from Abraham to David, 14. David deported to Babylon, 14. Deported to Babylon to the Christ is 14. So Jesus is he's the final. He's it. Well, who cares about 14 and 14 and 14? Well, that's interesting. Why not say 777? Why is it saying 14? We're not sure, but probably this. If you take the consonants of the Hebrew word, the best word there is in Hebrew, David, and just a joke, it's not DVD, it's Dawid. If you add up these numbers, remember your old numbers, Gematria people? Gematria is the word we use for using numbers for letters. Remember like 616, 666? You add these numbers up, guess what you get? 14. So the number of my beast is 14. So this is probably an homage to David. If you're a Jew, you get it. So we have major categories of all the way up to the Babylon exile and so forth. Something that's real interesting is the women mentioned. The women mentioned. And there's a lot of story. They have Rahab. You have verse 3. You've got Tamar, right? Genesis 38. You have Rahab. You have verse 5.
They're all
Got
listed as
Ruth.
mothers.
You got Bathsheba.
They only get their designation as being mothers, though.
They get designation as mothers. There's a lot of things people ask, why these women? Because women were only used for his own purpose. And to save a lot of time, what's interesting is these are women who were were associated with Gentiles, and they had very irregular unions with the person. And so in this kind of genealogy, and it's setting up to what we call Mother Mary, she's sure had an irregular union, right? And in Matthew, we have a big emphasis upon what? Especially at the very end, bringing in all Gentiles. And so what Matthew is probably trying to do, let us to see, is that God will use anybody he wants. If you look at all these stories of Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Tamar, they're all praised by the Jews because they help out Israel. And in later Jewish tradition, about the same time Matthew's being written, and a little bit later, Jewish interpreters always praise them. These are Gentiles who helped Israel along. So a lot of people say they're all dirty sinners, and that's what God uses any sinner he wants. That might be true. The problem is Jews didn't see them as dirty sinners. Jews praised them as being faithful Gentiles who helped Israel, not as dirty sinners. Mary was not a dirty sinner either.
Ruth was a convert, wasn't she?
Well, Ruth was a convert, you might call it that. Intermarried, yeah.
Did you say that Abraham
was a Gentile?
Yes, I did. I said Abraham was a Gentile. Yeah, Abram. Remember, he comes from the land of Ur of the Chaldeans. So yeah, he's flat out. He gets circumcised. Yeah, good question. Good question. I always thought it was kind of ironic that the father Abraham wasn't a Jew.
That's why I was in.
Right, right. So the 12 tribes of Israel, right, that just comes
Yeah,
later.
God, you know,
Dispersed, yeah, right, right. But when Abraham first came to the land of Canaan, there are no Jews there.
right.
They come from his loins, and then they get circumcised, and then they start following Yahweh to some degree. Then they call him Hugh from Judah, Judahites, people who lived in the area. That's right. And I preached on this when I first got here, which I know you all memorized, and that was Abram's call. And I taught 2 Sundays on that, and I led up to the Tower of Babel or Babel. Anyway, I talk about Abram and how he says, leave your kinfolk and your people. And I said, because John Walton, the Old Testament scholar, I think he's right. That's a call to leave your foreign gods. I mean, they were pagans. He's around 2000 BC and just says, okay, where do you want me to go? And then he comes in. So we have this genealogy. It shows pedigree. Jesus is son of David. He is royalty. He's in line. Now, one little quick thing about that. You need to understand that, well, I'll move on. It's fulfilling God's promises. I want to move on with that. So, verse 18 and following, it's very important. Now, I'm not trying to have you lose your faith, but this is not just a Christmas story. Matthew does not use this as a Christmas story. In Matthew 18, he says, it doesn't say the birth of Jesus Christ. It says the genealogy of Jesus Christ took this place away. This is Matthew's way of explaining more of what he just said. But he's going to have to explain something. 18 and following, which everyone reads every Christmas season, which is fine to do. He's got to explain verse 16. Read verse 16. It says this, and Yaakov, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who's called Christ or Messiah. Well, Rick, what in the world? We have these children and grandchildren, great-grandkids, and whatever. Generation doesn't mean literally the next child. He skips big old generations. He skips hundreds of years. And then all of a sudden he goes, turns left or right, makes a detour. And he's married to Mary. He's not even Joseph's baby. Why set this whole genealogy based on Joseph? And he's not even related to Joseph. That's verse 16. Remember, we're going to see this in a story in a second because, right, he knew her not. So how in the world can he be the son of David from Joseph's line who's not related to Joseph? Why have 16 verses, basically, making the whole point? So this next section is to explain verse 16. In what way is Jesus son of David if he's not even related paternally to Joseph? Through Mary. Yeah, he's related to Mary, but not related to Joseph. This whole next story, that's the point. The Lamb was chosen through the Spirit, right? But what's going to say is he adopts them. So in Christmas, we go, isn't this amazing? He's born of a virgin, miracle, miracle, virgin. He assumes that. That's not his point. He's trying to make the argument, how in the world is this guy son of David if he's not even the daddy? So, of course, we like that part. It sells the Christmas cards, but we're also very Gentile. If we were Jewish, we'd go, hold on now, we got to explain this. So he does in verse 18, the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, that's met stage 1 in marriage. I'm going to go pretty fast since I'll probably do this every year to some degree for Christmas time. She's in marriage part 1. Before they came together, which would have been the case, it's been very uncommon to get together before marriage. Can you imagine that? Not having sex before. I'm sorry, I'll stop preaching. She was found, and I know a lot of people are guilty. I'm just saying, I'm condemning all of us who have done it. Before they came together, she was found to be with child of the Holy Spirit. That's it. There's no extra special. It's just like, what does that mean? It's not even argued. It's just assumed in the text. But here's the problem. In Deuteronomy 22, 23 to 27, this is bad news. It either means she was raped, or it means she's a prostitute. It means she sleeps around, and he has a right to divorce her. He's legally obligated and morally obligated to divorce her. Otherwise, it's like he permits evil in the midst. And if they found out that he married this whore or prostitute and didn't do anything about it, they would have nailed him for it. It says that in Deuteronomy. You drag him out if you don't do something about it. But he's a righteous man. He's righteous. Or your translation might say, verse 19, he's a just man. Righteous means he knows the law, but he's unwilling to put her to shame. It means he's merciful. He's the ideal Jew. He wants to do what the law says, but he doesn't just, he what? Loves mercy, right? He acts justly, but he loves mercy. He's a good guy. He resolves to divorce her quietly. He doesn't have to. Think about that. Because if you divorce her quietly and something goes on, like what happened? Why didn't it work out? But as he considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, as they always do. Not really, but in Matthew they do. Saying, Joseph, son of David, did you miss it? Son of David, son of David. Matthew's beating like a drum. Hopefully you see that now. Do not fear to take Mary your wife, for that which is conceived of hers of the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you're going to call him Yeshua, which basically means Yahweh saves, for he will save his people from their sins. What's so striking is in Psalm 138, it says God saves people from their iniquities. God the Father. Here he's saying, you call him Yeshua because he will save his people from their sins. It's a big deal. And all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. And he quotes Isaiah 7:14. Behold, I'm saying your translation probably says, behold the virgin. And Isaiah 7:14, it doesn't say that. It says, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name should be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. If you don't know that, it does. Oh, let me get the red one. Very, very quickly. Remember when I told you, those who were here, hallelujah with an H is straight from the Hebrew. Alleluia, no H, that's straight from the Greek. Alleluia, hallelujah mean the same thing, praise Yahweh. Well, Emmanuel with an I, you ever seen the other way? What's the other way? Emmanuel. Well, these are very different words. No, they're not. Emmanuel, it comes from the Hebrew. Emmanuel comes from the Greek. It means the exact same thing. Em with Manu, us. El is God. With us, God. God with us. Emmanuel. So, Matthew, the evangelist, is telling us that he represents God with us. That's not what the angel tells Joseph. Jesus wasn't walking around in his hometown and say, hey, Manu, come here. Manny. That's not his childhood name. His name was Yeshua. But this is Matthew's way of giving another sermon little point. When you see Jesus, you see God with us. I have a lot of other point about that, but I'm not going to say it right now. When Joseph woke from his sleep, he did exactly what the angel of the Lord commanded him. He's a faithful Jew, and he took his wife. But he knew her not until she had born a son, and he called him Yeshua. So he was obedient. He was obedient. And he named the son. He named the son. That's important because we know later on the rabbi said that the father, when the father names the son, basically the son exists. And if the father claims the child, then it's the child. The father doesn't claim the child, is not the child. So we may not care much today. Hayden or Julia came out of the Caesarean. I didn't go, I shall call you Hayden, he is mine. Everyone in the room assumes that dude's mine with the red hair, and that's cool too. I was glad he looked a little bit like me. And Julia, that was good news. But I didn't have to declare it. Everyone assumes it, DNA and all that stuff. But in the ancient world, if I said and walked off quietly, I don't claim him. It's not my responsibility. So that's what's going on here. He called him Yeshua. So he's owning him. Who gives a rip? Well, they do in the story because that's answering verse 16. That's how it happens. That's how Jesus can be the son of David from the line of David through Joseph, because Joseph adopts him. Well, who cares about that? Well, in the ancient world, when you adopt one, you get full rights and privileges thereof. You're not kind of like a son. Boom, done. The word Pendergrass, the story is like a great-great-grandfather was adopted by the Pendergrasses. In fact, I did a little genealogy study and got back, I think his name was John Pendergrass. But when the census people came around, knocked on the door and who are your kids, who you got, wrote down names. And I've seen the census record of 18 whatever. And it says John Pendergrass and the daddy's some other Pendergrass. If the legend's true, that's it. Because if the original kid's parents died and he just come on in, you're ours, well, that's it. There's no adoption papers. And that's why I stopped there, because everything else about it may be worthless. So I don't know who my parents are. So I don't know. I'm probably not a Pendergrass. If it's true, then I was my great-great-grandfather was adopted by the Pendergrass clan, and there you go. So after that, I have no idea. So I might be related to all of you in here. Who knows? So that's the answer to the question. How can he be the son of David? There you go. This next part explains how in the world is Jesus the Messiah if Messiahs come from Bethlehem, as we're about to learn, but Jesus is associated not with Bethlehem. He's called Jesus of, he's called Nazareth. Well, what in the world? Nazareth is a little baby. It's smaller than Bethlehem. It's tiny. Estimates put it at a few hundred people tops. It's a village. Well, if the Messiahs don't come from Nazareth, they come from Bethlehem. How in the world did he get there? This next whole story explains that. But I'm just real quickly, does it matter that Jesus is born of a virgin? Yeah. I'm not talking much about it on purpose now because Matthew doesn't. Matthew doesn't. And people go, well, Matthew 7, it really means not virgin. The original Isaiah 7 meant Alma, young woman, blah, blah, blah. I think all those points are irrelevant. That's a different story. But. So, chapter 2, verse 1, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. I love that word. Bethlehem means house of bread. He was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king. Herod was not a nice man. He had 3 of his sons killed because he thought they were going to take over his throne. His favorite wife, Miriam, killed. He even named a tower after her at Herod's temple after she was dead. He killed people who disagreed, who challenged his rule. He was Idumean by birth. He was not Jewish. And he was kind of a last straw. But he tried to make sure everyone was a little happy by building the largest temple the Jews had ever seen. It's called Herod's Temple. And they were very excited about that part. Right when he came into power, he killed almost all of the Sanhedrin. He killed almost all the Sadducees because they didn't like him. So he does not have a nice reputation with them, except that he built real nice buildings for them. But these wise men, these magi, if you're from the south, really it's magi. Magos is singular. You know that because you know the word magician, from which the word comes. Magoi is one way the weirdos in Greek say it, but it's magi. That's plural. Wise men is fine. Astrologers is better. Well, they are not. They are not kings. It is not we three kings of Orient aren't. They're not kings. These are astrologers. These are basically Persian priests who work with the kings, and they watch the stars and do all kinds of divinization to figure out what the god wants. And if it is Persian, which they almost certainly are, there's a religion called Zoroastrianism. Zoroaster is his Greek name. Zoroastrianism. From Zoroaster was the teacher. He taught that Ahura Mazda was the great god. Mazda like the car, Ahura Mazda. And good and evil and right and wrong. And it's kind of sort of monotheistic religion. But they're watching the stars like they always do. They were known in the ancient Greeks and Romans and Jews knew if anybody's going to be watching the stars for a king to be born, it's the Magi. It's their job. Their job. So guess what happens? They come from the east. That's a lot of stories there too. Where is he to be born? King of the Jews. We've seen his star. It is not in the east. In Greek, it should be at its rising. We've seen his star at its rising, like a constellation that rose. It's not in the east. That's a bad translation. And I've come to pay him homage, to worship him. In Matthew, Jesus is paid homage to and worshiped throughout the whole gospel, particularly by Gentiles. They're good guys over and over and over again in Matthew's gospel. Now, Herod the king heard this. He goes, hot dog, we got a new king. Yay. No, he didn't. He was very troubled with all Jerusalem with him. Jerusalem and Jerusalemites are never given a good sell in Matthew. They're always, I'm going to preach on, in fact, the Sunday when Jesus comes in this final entry. People, wow! And then Jerusalem, it says, and the earth shook. It's like an earthquake happened. They can't stand it. So the Jerusalem elite do not like this. He was troubled, and he assembled all the chief priests and scribes of the people. He inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. That's really weird that he says that, because not long before this, he would have had them all killed. But there's the point. There's a theological point for saying this. Verse 5, they told him. The point is that they know where to look, and they're not looking. These Jewish elite priests and preachers aren't looking where they should be looking. They said, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so is written by the prophet, You know the rest. O you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, by no means the least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come the ruler who will govern my people, Yitzrael. He's quoting from Micah 5, and then a little bit from 2 Samuel 5:2. The point is, these guys are condemned. They know where to be looking, but they're not looking. Here are these foreigners, Gentiles from 1,500 miles away. They're more in tune to what God's doing in the world than these people who should know better. It's a constant slam on the Jewish leadership all through Matthew. They're always obtuse. They're always bleh. Verse 7, Herod summoned the wise men, these Magi, secretly. Hey, what time did that star appear? He sent to Bethlehem and said, hey, you go search diligently. When you find him, bring him word. We'll take him to Disney World. Woo! That's not at all what he'd do, of course. He wants to kill him right away. When they heard the king, they went their way. And they don't need directions anyway. They went to Jerusalem to find out where he's supposed to be born. Come to find out, star takes them. I'm going to skip way ahead. You know what happens, right? They come in, they give him gifts. You know how that works, right? Verse 13, they departed. Behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take your child. So they departed. Why is that? Because Herod does what? Verse 16, he sends word that all the male children of Bethlehem and the region, 2 years and under, are supposed to be killed. Well, he's like Pharaoh and the Egyptians who are trying to kill off the new leader. And that's sad. It would have been not many children at all. Bethlehem would have been a tiny village, but it's still sad. Verse 19, but when Herod died, so what the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. I skipped that part. If you don't know that story, then go back and read it. But he goes to Egypt. In Judaism, Egypt is often used as a refuge. It's a place of, not vacation, but refuge. It's an asylum city, town. That's not uncommon at all. And then verse 20, rise, take the child and his mother, go to the land of Israel. For those who sought the child's life are dead. He rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. Now we're getting close to why in the world this guy is called a Nazarene. When he heard Archelaus reigned over Judea in the place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. That's why he went there. And he went and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. And that's a weird play on words. Not said, well, I won't tell you what, anyway, but nevertheless, that is the reputation of Jesus. And in Matthew's gospel, he's called Jesus the Nazarene. So the first, and again, it's fast, but it's because of the typical Christmas story. I won't go that fast otherwise. But so in Matthew's understanding, the first big narrative of the so-called wise men, of Joseph and the dream narrative, is to explain how in the world Jesus is really the son of David, royalty. The line of Jesus is not even related to him. The answer is he was adopted. Why was he adopted? Because Mary had a supernatural spirit pregnancy that God ordained and took care of him. And God was taking care of him. And so he's both divine origin and human adopted. In the ancient world, they had kind of stories, but ours is Jesus. And the second major story of the wise men coming explains how in the world did the Jews recognize it? Because they were obtuse, they weren't looking. And why was he called Nazarene if he's really Messiah's come from Bethlehem? Here's how it happened. He was born in Bethlehem, where Messiah's come from. But he ended up Nazareth because it was a way to be rescued from the Pharaoh, from Herod trying to kill him.